Okay, so when you think about a postpartum mental health crisis, what comes to mind? For most of us, it's those first few chaotic weeks right after the baby is born. That's the picture, right? And, our entire system of care is built around that idea. But what if that picture is totally wrong? What if the real breaking point, the real crisis, is hiding in plain sight, happening months later than anyone thought? Well, a huge new study is here, and it's about to flip that whole timeline on its head.
So, the big question is, when does a postpartum crisis really hit? Seems simple, doesn't it? But wow, the answer is so much more complicated and, honestly, pretty surprising. We're going to dive into the data that completely challenges one of the biggest assumptions we have about when new parents are most vulnerable.
All right, before we drop the big bombshells from this study, let's just set the stage. Let's talk about what we thought we knew. Because to really get why this new data is such a game changer, you have to understand just how high the stakes are.
And yeah, let's be super clear here. We are not just talking about the baby blues. The stakes are incredibly, tragically high. I mean, suicide is a leading cause of death in that first year postpartum. That fact alone makes getting the timing of care right, well, it's not just important, it's an absolutely critical public health issue.
Now, if you look at the most severe end of this spectrum, you've got things like postpartum psychosis. And this is not just depression, okay? This is a full-blown psychiatric emergency. It affects about 1 in every 1,000 new mothers, and it often means hospitalization is necessary just to manage the risks and keep everyone safe. It's a really key piece of this whole story.
So here's the bottom line, the thing we've all believed for decades. The medical world has always operated on this one big idea, that the highest risk period is immediately after birth. Those first few weeks, maybe the first month, 3 months at the absolute most. And that single belief has shaped everything, from doctor's appointments to how families offer support. But the big question is it even right?
And this right here is where everything we thought we knew just gets turned completely upside down. See, a massive study out of British Columbia, Canada, decided to just look at the raw data without any of those old assumptions about timing. And what they found? Well, nobody saw it coming.
And we're not talking about some small survey here. No, this was huge. They looked at the health records for almost 190,000 deliveries over a 5-year period. The researchers literally tracked every single psychiatric hospitalization that happened within that entire first year after birth. So the picture they got was just incredibly clear and complete.
So first things first, they were able to confirm just how big this problem is. It turns out that for every 1,000 births, around 4 result in a psychiatric hospitalization. And that rate, it lines up pretty well with data from other countries, so we know we're dealing with a really solid, reliable number here.
Okay, now here's where the first big surprise pops up in the data. You probably think that a crisis serious enough to land someone in the hospital would mean a long stay, right? Like weeks to get stable and recover? Well, in reality, the median stay was just 3 days. 3! And while you can totally understand the push to get parent and baby back together, this super short stay might be a big reason why there's a shocking 20% readmission rate.
But as surprising as that was, the length of the hospital stay wasn't even the biggest shocker. Oh no, the real bombshell, the thing that changes everything, was about when these hospitalizations were actually happening. Seriously, just take everything you thought you knew about the postpartum timeline and throw it out the window. The median time for a psychiatric crisis serious enough for hospitalization wasn't in those first few weeks. It was at 5.5 months postpartum. Let that sink in for a second. 5.5 months. That is way past the usual 6-week checkup, which is when a lot of families are told they're pretty much out of the woods. And when you start to break it down by the specific condition, the picture gets even sharper. For postpartum psychosis, the median time to get to the hospital was around 3.5 months. For bipolar disorder, it was about 4 months. And for major depression, it stretched all the way out to nearly 5 months. So the real danger zone, it's just so much longer and happens so much later than we've all been led to believe.
Okay, so if we know the crisis is hitting later, the next logical question is, can we get better at figuring out who's most at risk? Well, the study gives us some really powerful clues there, too. It kind of shifts the whole conversation from when this happens to who it happens to. By digging into this mountain of data, the researchers were able to pinpoint the absolute strongest risk factors for a postpartum crisis. And just like with the timing, what they found, yeah, it was not what anybody was expecting.
So, what are the things that put someone at a higher risk? Well, as you'd probably guess, having a history of serious mental illness is definitely a big factor. But just look at that first bar on the chart.
The single strongest predictor of a postpartum psychiatric crisis was being younger than 20, a teenager.
I mean, just let that sink in for a minute. The researchers themselves pointed out how truly remarkable this is. Being under 20 was a more powerful risk factor than having a pre-existing diagnosis of schizophrenia or even being admitted to the hospital for psychiatric reasons during the pregnancy. It just really suggests that these younger parents are facing this perfect storm of biological, social, and financial pressures all at once.
So where does that leave us? What do we do with all this information? We've got a crisis that happens way later than we thought. And the biggest risk factor is one we might have overlooked. It really means our whole system of postpartum care, it might be built on a totally wrong timeline and a completely flawed set of assumptions.
The implications here are just huge. It means care and monitoring can't just stop at that 6-week checkup or even at 3 months. It needs to go on for the entire first year. It means we have to give special, focused attention to our youngest parents, and it absolutely means we have to fix what happens after a hospital stay to break that awful 20% readmission cycle. Basically, our whole approach has to catch up to what the data is telling us.
And so all of this leaves us with one really critical question to think about. We've built this entire system of care around the idea of an early postpartum crisis. But now, we have this powerful new data that shows us the real crisis. It often doesn't even show up for months. So the question is, are we pulling back our support right at the very moment when families need it the most?